January 1946. Norfolk, England, 6:12 hours. Frost lay across the hedgerows like powdered glass. The lorry coughed once, then went quiet, its exhaust curling into the pale dawn. 12 men clambered down into the mud, boots sinking with a sound that swallowed dignity. The wind smelled of salt, smoke, and the faint sweetness of wet barley fields sleeping under snow. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka straightened slowly. Rope burns raw at his wrists, his fingers stiff from restraint more than cold. For weeks he'd been trained to expect this moment, the collapse of everything that made him a soldier. His superiors had called it the shame of capture, worse than death. Better a blade to the belly than the humiliation of enemy mercy. But the enemy stood in front of him now, ordinary men in damp wool coats and scuffed boots. No rifles raised, no shouting. Just the faint clatter of tin mugs from a table under an awning and the smell of something impossibly warm. He braced for the blow anyway. A British corporal, middle-aged, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet, walked toward him. "Let's see those wrists," he said quietly. The man worked at the knots with thick, unhurried fingers until the cord came loose and fell away. "You'll freeze like that," he added, adjusting the collar of Hiroshi's coat as though he were dressing a brother. He pointed toward a low brick hut, leaking yellow light through the cracks. "Soup's inside." "Go on, lad." The word lad struck harder than any rifle butt could have. Inside, heat rolled over him like disbelief. Tin bowls lined a counter. Steam fogged the windows. The smell, onions, broth, barley, pulled something ancient and domestic from a place he'd buried years ago. His men shuffled forward, unsure, as if stepping into a trap made of comfort. A corporal handed out bowls one by one. No guards barked orders. No batons tapped against skulls. Hiroshi's fingers trembled as he accepted his. The soup was pale brown, the kind peasants would call humble, but the warmth seeped through the metal into his palms. He didn't drink at first. He waited for the cruelty hidden behind the kindness, the lash, the mockery, the order to kneel. None came. Around him, soldiers slurped quietly, steam ghosting their faces. One of them began to weep into his bowl, the sound muffled by hunger. Hiroshi lifted the spoon. The taste was salt, fat, and disbelief. The heat loosened something inside his chest. A memory of miso soup at home, his mother's laughter soft through the paper door. The shame came then, sudden and sharp, because the warmth of that British soup felt too close to the warmth of love. When the bowls were empty, a door opened at the far end of the room. A sergeant with a clipboard stood beside a young interpreter, a Japanese man in a British uniform whose voice was steady but not kind. "Names will be called," he said. "You will answer. You will not be harmed." One by one, the prisoners stepped forward, names checked, numbers matched, medical notes taken. A medic wrapped gauze around Hiroshi's wrists with a gentleness that felt almost surgical. "No infection," he said. "Keep it clean." Then, in clipped English, "You're safe now." Safe. The word sounded foreign, like a lie he wanted to believe. After processing, they were led into a larger hall lined with stoves. Posters in English and Japanese hung on the walls, rules, procedures, rations, no contraband, no escape attempts, work assignments required, medical attention provided, mail inspected but delivered. The handwriting was clean and even, bureaucratic mercy printed in black ink. The interpreter explained the policies, pausing after each one as though to make sure the words landed. "This camp operates under 4 principles," he said: security, utility, reciprocity, morality. The men exchanged uncertain looks. The corporal from earlier stepped forward and repeated the list in English, his tone flat but firm. Security means order. Utility means your work keeps you fed. Reciprocity means our prisoners in your country deserve the same. Morality. He glanced up. Morality means we stay human. No sermon followed, no cheers. Just the scratch of pens and the smell of coal smoke from the stoves. They were dismissed to barracks, Nissen huts, curved metal shells half buried in frost. Inside were bunks, wool blankets, and a single stove burning low. Hiroshi sat on the edge of his cot and stared at his hands. They were free now, but the skin still carried the memory of rope. He glanced at the wall where the rules were posted in his language. Every word read like a contradiction. Freedom inside fences, kindness from enemies, structure instead of vengeance. That night, he couldn't sleep. Around him, men whispered in half-dreams, names, prayers, apologies. The stove ticked as it cooled. He thought of the corporal's words. Morality means we stay human. It was the kind of thing his officers would have mocked before the war's end. Western sentimentality, they'd call it. But sitting in the quiet hum of the British night, Hiroshi began to wonder if it was something else entirely. Discipline. By morning, the frost had melted into mud. A truck engine coughed to life outside. Orders were read again, this time for work assignments. The interpreter's voice carried through the yard. Tanaka, Hiroshi, Bennett Farm, Barley Fields, 6 miles north. Report after mess. A few of the men turned to look at him. Hiroshi said nothing. He simply touched his wrists again, tracing the fading rope marks, and watched the steam rise from the breakfast pot. Later, as they filed toward the mess hall, the same corporal stopped him by the doorway. You did all right yesterday, he said almost conversationally. Farm work's hard but fair. The Bennetts are good folk. Don't make them regret asking. Hiroshi nodded once. The English words caught somewhere between his throat and his silence. Inside, a cook ladled out the same barley stew, thicker this time, with slices of bread cut unevenly but generous. Hiroshi took a bowl and sat by the window. Snow flurries drifted like ash, and for a fleeting moment the camp looked less like a prison and more like a small town keeping itself alive through winter. He didn't know then that the name Bennett would anchor his future. That behind that name was a farmhouse where decency had survived what bombs could not. He didn't yet know that a man who had lost his son in Burma would one day teach him the difference between mercy and weakness. For now, there was only soup, steam rising, bread breaking, and the faint sound of a kettle boiling somewhere beyond the frost. If war teaches a man how to kill, perhaps peace teaches him what to do with the hands left over. And for Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, that lesson began with a single bowl of soup. The lorry rattled north through the thawing countryside, its canvas sides swelling and collapsing with each breath of wind. Mud hissed under the tires, and the cold air smelled of smoke and damp straw. Inside, 6 men sat pressed together, silent, their faces drawn and eyes lowered. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka watched the frost-streaked fields slide past, each one smoother and quieter than the war he had left behind. When the truck finally slowed, the driver shouted, and the men straightened instinctively. The vehicle rolled to a stop beside a wooden gate with a small painted sign that read, Bennett and Son, Barley Farm. A man stood there, broad-shouldered, hands in his coat pockets, a wool cap pulled low against the wind. Arthur Bennett. He was older than Hiroshi had imagined an English farmer to be, his face carved by weather and work, but his posture was steady, solid as the land itself. The guard jumped down first, his boots splashing into the puddles. "Out you get," he said, motioning to the men. They obeyed without protest. lining up beside the truck as they had been trained to do. Arthur looked them over in silence. "You'll work 8 till 4, he said at last, his voice rough but even. "An hour for dinner. I'll treat you fair if you work fair. Don't make me regret asking." There was no hatred in his tone, only a farmer's plain expectation. From the doorway of the farmhouse a woman appeared, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Her hair was pinned back, a few strands catching the light. Elsie Bennet. She glanced at the prisoners, not flinching, not frowning, just studying them with quiet curiosity. Her gaze met Hiroshi's for a heartbeat, and he looked away first. The guard handed Arthur a clipboard. "You'll sign here, sir." "I'll be back at dusk." Arthur scrawled his name, handed the paper back, and nodded toward the fields. "Right then," he said. "Let's get started." When the truck drove off, its engine fading into the hills, the only sounds left were the crows and the creak of the farmhouse door. Arthur led them through the yard, past a rusting tractor and a shed filled with tools. "Start with the east fence," he said. Frost cracked half the rails. Hiroshi picked up a hammer, its handle worn smooth by years of hands before his. The weight was familiar, grounding. Work was something he understood. Work didn't lie. They labored until the sun rose higher, mending posts and hauling timber. The air was sharp and cold, but the rhythm of it steadied his thoughts. He watched Arthur work beside them, deliberate, tireless, saying little but making every strike count. At noon, the sound of a bell drifted from the farmhouse. Arthur set down his hammer. "Dinner," he said. The men followed him to the kitchen, where the warmth hit like a wave. The smell of bread and onions filled the air. On the table were plates laid out with thick slices of bread, cheese, and mugs of tea. Elsie motioned to the chairs. "Sit before it gets cold." The men hesitated. Hiroshi looked to Arthur, who was already taking his seat. "Go on," Arthur said, cutting a piece of bread. "She didn't make it for the chickens." The prisoners sat. Hiroshi lowered himself carefully, feeling the strangeness of wood beneath him that wasn't a barrack bench. He picked up a slice of bread. The crust cracked between his teeth, and butter melted on his tongue. The flavor was simple, but alive. Elsie poured tea into mismatched cups. "Sugar?" she asked. No one answered. She sighed, spooned a lump into each cup, and set them down. "Suit yourselves," she said. The kitchen was full of quiet sounds, the scrape of knives, the whistle of the kettle, the slow rhythm of breathing. To Hiroshi, those sounds were louder than any command. He ate slowly, feeling both grateful and guilty. That afternoon, they cleaned stalls and carried feed to the livestock. The wind sharpened, but Arthur kept them working until sweat steamed from their coats. When he finally called for a stop, he gestured toward the barn. "Warm up," he said. Inside, dust floated in narrow beams of sunlight. A tractor sat in the corner, red paint dulled with rust. Hiroshi stepped closer, running his hand along the side. He could almost feel the machine's heartbeat beneath the grime. Arthur noticed. "You know engines?" he asked. "A little," Hiroshi said softly. Arthur nodded and fetched a grease-stained manual. "English pictures," he said. "See what you can do." By the time the day ended, the engines sputtered, coughed, and came to life. Arthur's eyebrows rose. "Didn't think she'd start again," he said. Then, almost grudgingly, "Good work." Hiroshi bowed his head slightly. It was the first compliment he had received in months. That night, the men slept in the loft above the tool shed, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled faintly of hay. The floor creaked beneath them, and through a gap in the boards, Hiroshi could see the light from the farmhouse window. Inside, Elsie moved around the kitchen, stacking plates, folding a towel, winding the clock. The sight filled him with something that wasn't envy or longing, but a strange ache for a world that still made sense to itself. The next morning came wrapped in fog. Arthur's voice broke through it like a bell. East Field today, fence first. They worked until their hands went numb, then until they forgot the numbness. When noon came, Elsie arrived with sandwiches and a thermos balanced in a basket. She set them on the back of the truck. "Eat," she said, then turned and walked back toward the house. The guard shrugged. "Go on, lads." "She made it for you." Hiroshi took one of the sandwiches. The bread was still warm, the butter thick. He thought of the leaflets they'd read during training, the ones that showed Allied camps as pits of hunger and cruelty. He almost smiled at the irony. When the meal was done, Arthur called them back to work. He said no thanks, gave no praise, but that evening the shed door was left unlocked. By the end of the week, small habits began to change. Arthur's tone lost its edge. Elsie began to ask, almost absent-mindedly, how they liked their tea. Even the guard stopped counting heads twice. For Hiroshi, the transformation was quieter. Arthur now handed him tools handle first. Elsie no longer hesitated when he stepped into the kitchen to fill a pail of water. Each gesture chipped away at what the war had carved into him. On Sunday evening, as the bells from the village church drifted across the valley, Hiroshi sat on the fence he had repaired and watched the sunset burn over the fields. Beyond the horizon lay the country that had once defined him, now distant as a dream. Here, for the first time in years, there was warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with food or fire. Maybe this was what survival was supposed to feel like. Not victory, not surrender, just the quiet permission to exist. Spring came slow and damp, seeping into the bones of the countryside like a secret trying to heal. The frost melted into the furrows, and the barley fields stretched green and new beneath skies the color of pewter. Each morning, Hiroshi woke to the same sounds that had replaced war: Arthur's boots crossing the yard, Elsie's kettle whistling in the kitchen, and the rhythmic creak of the barn door opening to the day. He had begun to learn the language of quiet things. The cough of the tractor at dawn, the hiss of the bread oven, the smell of turned soil after rain. Where once there had been orders and explosions, there was now the patient repetition of life continuing. He worked without hesitation, carrying timber, mending rails, trimming the hedges. The routine steadied him. It gave shape to his guilt and direction to his hands. The Bennets had grown used to his presence. Arthur no longer watched every movement. Elsie no longer started when he entered the kitchen to fetch a pail of water. The dog no longer barked. Trust, Hiroshi had discovered, didn't arrive with ceremony. It crept in quietly, disguised as repetition. One morning, Arthur handed him a set of reins. "You can drive the milk cart," he said. "Guard'll come along first few times. Village folk will take a look, but they'll get used to you." Hiroshi bowed slightly. "Yes, sir." The road to the village wound between budding hedgerows and low stone walls. Belle, the old mare, pulled the cart at a slow, forgiving pace. A guard rode beside him, humming without melody, more bored than wary. When they reached the edge of the village, the morning light found the cobblestones wet and shining. At first, people stared. A few froze in the act of carrying crates or hanging laundry. Children stopped playing. A woman at the bakery doorway wiped her hands on her apron and tilted her head. Hiroshi kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the reins, waiting for the anger he'd been warned about. It didn't come. A boy, maybe 10 years old, raised a hand in an uncertain wave. Hiroshi hesitated, then nodded back. The boy grinned and ran to tell his friends. By the second trip, the baker called, "Morning, Tanaka," as if testing the word for weight. By the third, the guard stopped accompanying him altogether. Routine had replaced fear. The people saw not the uniform, but the cart, the milk, and the man who showed up every day to do the work. Back at the farm, Arthur said little, but nodded each time Hiroshi returned on schedule. That nod was worth more than any spoken praise. Later that week, letters arrived at the camp. Men read them by the fire, some laughing, some crying. Hiroshi had none waiting, but he asked for paper anyway. He wrote by lantern light, the words slow and careful. "I am alive. The British feed us. They let us work. They are not what we were told. The farmer's wife bakes bread for us. The man lost his son in the war. I don't understand why they show kindness, but I am learning to live with it." He signed his name neatly, folded the paper, and gave it to the guard for censoring. He doubted it would reach Japan, but writing it made it real. The next Sunday, the Bennets invited him to stay for supper. It was the first time he had eaten with them in the house rather than outside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of stew. On the mantel above the fire was a photograph in a brass frame. A young man in uniform, handsome and smiling. Beneath it, the engraving read, "Thomas Bennett, Burma, 1944. The air seemed to still. Elsie caught his glance. "Our son?" she said softly. "He never came back." Arthur's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Hiroshi had met him, he looked away. "I am sorry," Hiroshi said quietly. Arthur's eyes flicked back to him, unreadable. "You didn't do it," he said after a moment. "The war did." Hiroshi lowered his gaze. "He wore a uniform like mine," he said. Arthur sighed and rubbed a hand across his chin. "I, and you're both stuck with what came after dinner," continued in silence, the clatter of spoons louder than conversation. Afterward, as Hiroshi stood to leave, Arthur spoke again. "You'll be back at dawn then?" "Yes," Hiroshi said. Arthur nodded. "Good. That's all that matters." That night, Hiroshi lay awake in the loft above the toolshed, staring through a crack in the boards. The farmhouse glowed with lamplight. He saw Elsie set down 2 empty bowls and stare at the photograph before turning the light low. The next morning, he threw himself into work. He cleared drains, oiled hinges, tightened bolts. The silence between him and Arthur had changed. It wasn't distance anymore, but something denser, harder to name. Days later, a storm rolled in from the coast. Rain fell in sheets, turning the fields to rivers of mud. The tractor bogged down at the edge of the pasture, wheels spinning uselessly. Arthur shouted above the wind, trying to push it free. When his boot slipped, Hiroshi lunged forward and caught him by the arm. Together, they forced the machine loose, soaked to the bone and covered in mud. When they finally staggered into the barn, Elsie was waiting with towels and tea already brewing. "You'll both ruin your lungs," she said, shaking her head but smiling. Arthur sank into a chair by the stove, steam rising from his coat. "He saved my hide," he said, jerking his thumb toward Hiroshi. Hiroshi shook his head. "No, you saved me. You let me work." Arthur laughed softly, a tired, genuine sound. "You sound like my boy," he murmured. Then, after a pause, "Thank you, lad." They sat in silence while the rain hammered the roof. Elsie poured tea into mugs, her hands steady now. The steam rose between them like a truce. When the storm eased, Arthur opened the barn door. The fields glistened in the pale afternoon light, washed clean. He reached into a tin on the shelf and handed Hiroshi a small packet of tea. "For tomorrow," he said. "Long day ahead." Hiroshi accepted it with both hands, bowing slightly. "Thank you, Arthur." Arthur paused at the sound of his name. Then he nodded once. "Aye," he said. "Arthur will do." The wind moved gently through the barley outside. The storm had passed, but something deeper had shifted with it, a quiet acknowledgement between two men bound not by orders or mercy, but by loss, labour, and the fragile act of seeing one another as human. The first thunder rolled across the Norfolk fields just before dusk. The air had been heavy all afternoon, thick with the scent of soil and rain waiting to fall. Hiroshi was still in the lower field, stacking wood for the stove, when the sky broke open. The downpour was immediate and merciless, soaking through his coat within seconds. He ran toward the barn, boots slipping in the mud, and threw the doors shut behind him. The noise outside became a constant roar against the tin roof. Inside, the world was dim and golden. Lantern light flickered against the hay bales, turning the dust into slow, drifting constellations. Arthur was there already, wiping his hands on a rag, studying the storm through a crack in the boards. "Hell of a night," he muttered. Hiroshi nodded. His breath came in clouds. "The rain comes like monsoon," he said quietly. "In Japan, it sounds the same." Arthur grunted. "Can't say I'd enjoy that much of it." He set the rag aside and reached for a flask. "Tea," he said, "still warm." He poured 2 mugs and handed one to Hiroshi. Steam curled up between them. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the hiss of rain and the soft clatter of the roof. It had been nearly 2 months since Hiroshi first saw the photograph on the Bennett's mantel, the young man in uniform, smiling from another life. They had not spoken of it again, but the air tonight seemed full of unspoken things. Arthur took a slow sip and looked into the mug as if the answer to some old question might surface there. "You know," he said finally, "my boy used to sit right where you are. Mended that same harness, said it made him feel useful." Hiroshi listened, the words quiet but sharp. "He was 21, Arthur continued, didn't want to go to war. But he went, said he couldn't stay here while others went to fight. Last letter came from Burma, said the jungle never stopped raining." He stopped, breathing through his nose, jaw tight. When the notice came, Elsie didn't speak for 3 days. Not a word, just baked bread and hung it on the line for the neighbors. Like feeding others would keep him alive. The storm outside cracked, lightning flashing through the cracks in the wall. Hiroshi's hands trembled around the mug. "Burma," he said, barely audible. "My unit fought there." Arthur turned to him slowly. His face was unreadable, not angry, not calm, just human. "Aye," he said, "I figured as much." Hiroshi set the mug down. "I do not know where. I was pilot. We saw only sky and fire. We did not see faces. Arthur's gaze stayed fixed on him. "You don't have to answer for all that," he said. "I already do," Hiroshi whispered. "Every night." Arthur drew in a long breath. "I lost my son," he said. "You lost your country." "Guess that makes us even in some way," Hiroshi shook his head. "No, not even. Only empty." The rain grew louder, hammering the roof until it drowned the silence between them. Hiroshi pressed his palms together the way he had once done in the temples of his youth. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Arthur, I'm sorry." The words seemed to echo in the rafters. Not rehearsed, not formal. Just the truth, stripped bare. Arthur stared at him for a moment, then nodded once. "I know," he said softly. They stood that way for a long time, the farmer and the prisoner, the storm raging around them, 2 men bound not by war, but by what it had taken from them. Finally, Arthur walked to the corner and took a seat on the hay bale. "You ever think," he said, "that maybe mercy's the only thing left that makes sense after all this?" Hiroshi looked up, unsure if it was a question meant for him. "Mercy," he said slowly, as if testing the word. Yes, harder than hate. Arthur smiled faintly. That's about right. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered one. Smoke? Hiroshi hesitated, then accepted. The match flared, and for a brief moment their faces glowed in its small, defiant light. Outside, the rain began to ease. The thunder moved farther away, rolling across the distant hills like something exhausted. When the quiet finally came, Arthur rose and walked toward the open door. The air smelled of wet soil and clean beginnings. You'll be back on the tractor tomorrow, he said, as if nothing had changed. Yes, Hiroshi said. Arthur turned back and added, and after that, maybe you'll drive it into the village yourself. Don't see much sense in keeping a man behind fences when he's already proved he won't run. Hiroshi blinked. No guard. No need, Arthur said. Trust has to start somewhere. Hiroshi bowed deeply. Thank you. Arthur studied him for a moment, then said, almost under his breath, You've earned it. They walked together back toward the farmhouse, the mud clinging to their boots. The lights from the kitchen window shone through the mist, soft and golden. Inside, Elsie had laid out 2 towels by the fire and a pot of tea that had been waiting all along. As Arthur stepped inside, he glanced back at Hiroshi. Tomorrow, we fix that gate before the stock gets through, he said. Hiroshi smiled faintly. Yes, Arthur. Arthur paused in the doorway. You know, lad, he said, you remind me of him sometimes. Not the uniform, the way you keep trying to make things right. Hiroshi bowed his head. I will never forget that. The farmer nodded and went inside. Hiroshi lingered for a moment under the dripping eaves, watching the steam rise from the fields as the rain turned to mist. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to everything. The smell of wet hay, the warmth of the lantern, the unspoken peace that had finally taken root. He thought of Thomas Bennett's name on the brass plate above the hearth and the weight of Arthur's hand on his shoulder. He thought of how forgiveness could live quietly, like embers in ash, warming a house without burning it. When he finally closed the barn door behind him, the night was still, and for the first time in years, he did not feel like a prisoner. Winter returned with a quiet kind of certainty. Frost whitened the edges of the fields, and each breath hung like a small ghost in the morning air. The orders came in a sealed envelope delivered to the farm one pale afternoon. Arthur opened it by the fire and read without expression. When he finished, he folded the paper neatly and looked at Hiroshi. They're sending you home, he said. Home. The word landed softly, but it didn't feel like it used to. Japan was no longer the place he remembered. The streets he'd grown up on were ash now, the voices he knew scattered or gone. Still, he nodded. When? End of the month, Arthur said. Ship leaves from Liverpool. Elsie looked up from her knitting. That soon, she murmured. She set the wool aside and stood, smoothing her apron as though the motion might keep her steady. Then we'd better start baking. The last week moved slowly, full of the small tasks that had defined their days together. Hiroshi fixed the stable hinges and stacked the winter wood. Arthur checked the fencing twice, though he knew it didn't need it. Elsie baked more than usual, the smell of bread filling every room, as if she could ward off silence with flour and heat. On the final morning, the frost lay thick and bright. Hiroshi rose before dawn, his few belongings packed into a canvas sack. The scarf Elsie had knitted weeks before was wrapped around his neck, soft and worn from use. When he stepped into the kitchen, the Bennets were already waiting. Elsie handed him a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "Bread for the road," she said, "fresh this morning." Arthur reached into the cupboard and brought out a tin of tea. "For when you settle somewhere quiet," he said, No chains here, Hiroshi. Only work and decency. Hiroshi bowed low, lower than he ever had before. Thank you, he said, voice breaking, for everything. Arthur hesitated, then extended his hand. You did your part, he said. That's all any of us can do. Their hands met, farmer and former enemy, and the moment held longer than either expected. When the lorry came to collect him, the fields shimmered with a thin glaze of ice. He climbed aboard and turned once more to see the farmhouse standing solid against the wind. Elsie waved a small handkerchief. Arthur raised 2 fingers in a quiet salute, not of rank, but of understanding. The road curved away, and the Bennets vanished from sight. Hiroshi watched the land roll past, the barns, the hedgerows, the smoke rising from distant chimneys, and felt the ache of something he hadn't known he could feel again. Belonging. Liverpool smelled of salt and steel. The harbour was crowded with men in worn uniforms, each carrying pieces of lives they no longer recognized. As Hiroshi stepped onto the ship, he reached into his coat pocket. Inside was the tin of tea, dented slightly from travel. He held it tight. The sea wind cut through his clothes, but the memory of the Bennets' kitchen kept him warm. Years passed. The war faded into books and numbers. Hiroshi found work in a small factory near Osaka, later teaching apprentices how to repair engines. He married, raised children, and grew old without ceremony. Yet every winter, when the air turned cold and the frost gathered on the windows, he would take out the tin of tea and set it beside the stove. In 1980, a British journalist came to interview him for a piece on former prisoners of war. They sat in his small kitchen as steam rose from their cups. The reporter asked what he remembered most about his time in Britain. Hiroshi smiled faintly. "The soup," he said first. Then, after a pause, "and the bread. They could have broken me with chains, but they broke me with kindness. I learned strength without cruelty." Outside, snow began to fall, soft as the mist that had once hung over the Norfolk fields. He lifted his cup, inhaled the steam, and saw the memory as clearly as if it were still there. The warm kitchen, the hum of Arthur's tractor, the sound of Elsie's bread knife cutting through a fresh loaf. Civilization, he had learned, was not in the victory or the weapon. It was in the hands that offered food instead of fists, in the choice to build instead of burn, in the quiet courage to treat an enemy as human. He closed his eyes, the tea's warmth seeping into his palms. The years, the distance, the grief, they all folded into that single truth. Mercy had outlasted the war. If you felt this story reach somewhere deeper than history, share it. Tell someone how peace is built, not with walls or flags, but with bread shared between those once divided. Leave a comment if you believe strength is not in what we destroy, but in what we choose to save. Like, subscribe, and keep the conversation alive. Some stories deserve to be remembered for what they healed, not what they hurt.